Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. In today's video, I'm making a dress for the Met Gala. Okay, I'm sort of making a dress for the Met Gala. I'm not going to the Met Gala. I wasn't invited to the Met Gala, but they say you should dress for the job you want, and I'm assuming you should also dress for the parties you want to go to. The theme for this year's Met Gala is the Gilded Age, which is a period of time that took place at the end of the 19th century. And it just so happened that I had a late 19th century project planned and a pile of fabric to create it. So I decided this was just the motivation I needed to actually create it, and of course I filmed the entire process for all of you. So I hope you enjoy seeing how I made my dress for the Met Gala, even though I'm not going to it. I was just editing that intro and realized I didn't really explain what I'm making. So this project is inspired by a few fashion plates, but it is ultimately an original design. It's going to consist of a few different components that I will reference throughout the video, and I thought a little drawing might help make it all make more sense as you're watching. So the first thing I'm going to be making is an underskirt that supports everything else. This has a relatively large train and is made entirely out of silk with a partial tulle overlay. I'm going to be mounting a whole bunch of my ruffled fabric on top of this to give it texture and volume. Once it's mostly constructed, I'll be draping these apron or drape panels that go over top of it. And they're going to be two separate panels that have a few different sections to make it look like they're a lot more than just two panels. The first of these is going to be longer and extend nearly to the hem, and then the second one is going to sit atop it and be a bit shorter. These are going to be pleated at the back, and then at the back there's going to be a panel that comes down at a diagonal angle, and I'm going to mount a big bow at the hem and a little bow at the top of it. Then of course there will also be a bodice with a wide collar and some cute little sleeves. And I'm going to go a lot more in depth about this design and the process of constructing it throughout this video, but I thought this served as a good start. And speaking of good start, I should also talk about the materials I'm starting out with. The fabric that really inspired this project is this really cool pre-ruffled mesh. It consists of a mesh material with all of these mesh polka dot ruffles stitched to it. Now, Victorian costumes tended to incorporate a lot of ruffles into them, and I'm a huge fan of ruffles, but they take a lot of material and a lot of time to make. So having a pre-ruffled fabric allows you to cheat a little bit and get all of that wonderful ruffly goodness without the time and effort and energy it would typically take to make each one by hand. To go along with this fabric, I purchased a silk. This was ordered online and unfortunately didn't really match the ruffled fabric that well, so I'm also going to be using some lighter colored red tulle as an overlay for the silk to make everything the same tone. I'm going to be using a white polyester file for a lot of the trimming, and then I bought this really cute, amazing white mesh with these flocked hearts on them, and I thought this would make adorable ruffles, because of course it needs more ruffles. I struggled a lot with draping the overskirt portions later on. The underskirt was pretty easy to drape and draft. You can see the muslin on my dress form here, and I just traced around all of those pieces onto tracing paper and added seam allowances to create a pattern. You can see me cutting the pattern out here. The pieces were so large I didn't actually pin them to my fabric. Instead, I just used weights to keep them in place while I cut around them. Then I had to figure out where the ruffles would be positioned on these pieces, so I could figure out where the overlay would be positioned on these pieces, which has to be attached before I can get them sewn together. So for the last couple of hours, I've been trying to figure out how much of this I want to be ruffled. And I want as much of it to be ruffled as possible because I love ruffles, but the further away we go from the hem, the more tapered and the smaller the circumference of the skirt gets. So this specific panel is only 18 inches wide, 22 inches away from the hem, which is where I was originally going to mount. And then at the hem, it is almost 36 inches wide. So if I cut a piece of ruffled fabric, I want it to be wide enough for the ruffles to sit smoothly around the hem. So it'd have to be at least 36 inches wide, and then I'd have to gather the top down pretty heavily to get to fit smoothly at that point. And that's going to create a lump right there where the gathers are that looks really bulky. So I think what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have a 6-inch piece of ruffled fabric, another 6-inch piece, another piece that's 10 inches, and then I don't have to cut it to be 36 inches wide and gather it down to half that width of the top edge. Instead, for this first one, I can cut it to be 23 inches wide, and then it will be gathered down to 18 inches. And then the next one will cut to be 30 inches, and it'll be gathered down to 23 inches. And I shouldn't end up with a giant, bulky, gathered line that the ruffled panels just hang freely from. So that is what I have to get sorted out today. And it's going to be a little bit more challenging than I was originally envisioning, which was just going to be cutting a giant rectangle of ruffles panels and then gathering it down, attaching it to the skirt. So the bottom portion of these panels are going to be covered with the ruffled mesh, which unfortunately does not match my base fabric. So to alter the color of the base fabric slightly, I'm doing an overlay of 2 layers of bright red tulle. So I'm just cutting out this overlay by laying the tulle over top of my pattern and then cutting approximately 1 inch below where the ruffles are going to begin. And it's going to be basted on to the upper portion of the base layer of the skirt or the underskirt or whatever you want to call it. So I've gotten them all cut out and now I just have to get them pinned on and then basted on, and I can seam together the underskirt and see how it looks. My room is way too small for this project, and yesterday when I was working on this, my dog was barking incessantly, so I didn't film that, but I will lay this flat and show you what I've been up to. So all I really got done was I got the skirt pieces cut out, which I did film, and then I cut out the tulle overlay for the upper portion, which helps change the tone of it, so it better matches the mesh I'm using for the ruffles. I machine basted the edges of the tulle on, then I seamed the panels together, and I did add 1 inch seam allowances onto this, and I thought about doing French seams, but everyone gets mad at me when I use French seams on thicker fabric, and this is a pretty thick fabric even though it is still a silk. So instead I just used 1 inch seams, but since it is quite prone to fraying, I then folded the seam allowance towards the back of the skirt and top stitched it down twice. And we'll have to fray past those 3 lines of stitching to actually affect the structural integrity of the skirt, which I really don't think is going to happen. And then after that was all done, I just used pinking shears to clip the seam allowance down relatively close to the final line of stitching. So that is what it looks like from the interior, and that is what it looks like from the exterior. It is not my nicest looking top stitching, but that's okay because most of it's going to be hidden. And this is what an edge looks like after it has been pinked, and these are the ones that have not yet been pinked. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm cutting out the ruffles, and I've already cut most of them, and I filmed a bunch of that, so you've probably seen it speeded up already. But I'm not cutting through the actual ruffles, I'm lifting the ruffle up and then cutting through the mesh that they are attached to. So it's a little bit tedious having to do this because I don't want to end up accidentally cutting through the ruffles, and I have to cut several, like 7-yard lengths of these. But I'm almost done. Once this is done, I get those lengths sewn together, and I'll have to be very careful sewing them together because I want the ruffles to all line up perfectly at the seams so the seams aren't super noticeable. But then once that's done, I can start putting them on my skirt. Okay, that's a lie. I should hem the skirt and then I can start putting them on the skirt. And I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to hem the skirt just yet, so that is another thing to do before I can start putting them on the skirt. But we will get to that part eventually today, I hope. So the skirt is now hemmed. I did not do a particularly nice hem. I basically basted 1 inch away from the edge, and then I used my iron to press the fabric inward at that stitch point. And then just by hand while I was sewing, I turned the inner edge inward and stitched it down. So it didn't end up being very even on the interior, but it should be even overall because it was creased at that basting line. I've also gone ahead and sewn my ruffles together to form extra long lengths of ruffles, and the seams are sort of noticeable but not overly so. I think it'll be fine as part of the finished garment. So I went through and pinned the bottom ruffle onto the hemline, and then I just stitched across one of the stitch lines on the ruffled mesh so I wouldn't be creating a new line of machine stitching. And that secured the bottom edge, and then I just sort of eased it upward and pinned it down along the top edge, and now by hand I'm basting that edge down. At the front it is pretty flat because there isn't a lot of curvature to the panel, so the hem is the same width as the point 10 inches away from the hem. But at the back where the panels get narrower towards the top, there is quite a bit of easing. So I'm not outright gathering the fabric, but I am doing really tiny pleats and whatnot when basting it down. Alright, so I've officially sewn on one panel, and then I got the second panel sewn on. You can see these stitch points on the interior. The top edge of this second strip was gathered slightly at various points and then top stitched down so it follows the curvature of the skirt. And now I have one more ruffle to add, or at least one more ruffle to add. I'm worried it's going to come up a little bit short and it won't fully overlap with the tulle overlay, in which case I'd have to add another ruffle to bridge that gap. I'm also not sure how symmetrical this is going to end up being since I've just been doing it by eye, but I'm going to hope for the best for now and get the third layer sewn on. I plopped the skirt on my dress form last night and it actually looked really good, but I decided it needed another tier of ruffles. So I cut out another approximately 6-inch wide strip, and I've got the bottom edge sewn on, and I sewed the bottom edge on just by aligning this ruffle until it slightly overlapped the top edge of the ruffle in the row before it. And then I just pinned across that edge and I stitched it on across the lowest line of machine stitching so I wouldn't be creating another visible line of stitching. And now to secure this top edge, because it's just hanging in the breeze here, I'm going to lay the skirt out as flat as I can, which is getting increasingly difficult as I move up the skirt. And I'm sort of gently pulling on the mesh, not enough to stretch it, but just enough to make sure that it isn't drooping and going to hang unevenly. But I also want to make sure that it's not like being pulled up so tight that it's wrinkling the silk underneath it. So as you can see, we're still sitting flat here. It's just on an angle because this panel slopes down. This is the side panel. And for every one of these, I've been starting at the center front and then working my way outward to try and get it as symmetrical as possible. So I've done this half the front panel and the side panel, and I'm going to repeat that on the other side. This has gone shockingly well. I'm really happy with the shape it has on my dress form and how well the ruffles follow the curvature of the skirt. I'm definitely glad that I decided to do it in sections instead of just one big gathered chunk. I think it has made it look a lot more elegant. And after this is on, I'm going to do one final ruffle that I'm going to finish the top edge of it so there isn't this piece of mesh hanging out, which just helps bridge the gap between each section. And I actually have a sketch pad underneath the dress, creating a layer between it and the other side of the skirt, because otherwise I'm going to accidentally catch fabric from the other side of the skirt when pinning, which is a pain in the butt. So this is the back, and this is where it can no longer lay flat because the top edge has a smaller diameter than the bottom edge where I initially sewed it on. So this is where it requires a little bit of easing, and I do also have where the ruffle overlaps, so I have to keep that in mind as well. So this is still very much the same process of trying to get the mesh as flat as possible. I'm just also trying to smooth it out so it follows the curve of the skirt. And again, I'm working from one side to another to make sure that I'm getting that volume dispersed symmetrically. So I don't want one side to be super gathered and one side to not be gathered at all. Alright, so I think that is pretty decent, and when I go over to the sewing machine, I'm going to smooth this out further. I got the final 6-inch section sewn on, and then I sewed up the rest of the back seam. Well, not the rest of the back seam. I left the top 12 inches open to create an opening to get it on and off. But originally when I was sewing on the ruffles, I only sewed up the bottom 24 inches or so, because I'd have the flexibility of having it open down to this point. But now that the ruffles are on, I could go ahead and sew that up, and after sewing that up, I did just trim the seam allowance down with pinking shears like I have for everything else. So now it's time to put on the final ruffle. Alright, so I think all of the ruffles are on, and I haven't put it on my dress form yet, but I'm feeling pretty happy with it. So I think I'm going to go through and clip threads because there definitely are some. I also want to remove pins from this, which means I have to sew up the points where the ruffles overlap. I'm not going to do a super thorough job, just a couple tacking stitches to make sure that this doesn't flare up and show what's underneath. So there's one line there. There's one line here, there's one line here, and then there's one on that tier as well. So just from the underside, I'm going to go through and tack those down. Yesterday, I finished sewing on all of the ruffles to the underskirt, and I got the back sorted out so it is all tacked closed. And now I'm trying to figure out the overskirt, so this part right here. I am very bad at draping bustly things. Like anything from the 1870s through the 1880s, I just find very difficult. So it probably took me like 2 hours to drape this yesterday. I did not film it, but I ended up coming up with something I was relatively happy with, which consists of 2 layers of fabric. So I got that transferred from muslin onto tissue, or onto tracing paper rather, and now I have it laid out here. And on top of this, they're going to be bands. So I don't know if you can tell, but this is like draped and pleated. Now, if you look at the color image, there are actually strips of contrasting colors here. So I figured out how I want that all to look over here. And now I'm creating the pattern for those pieces that will sit atop the draped panels. So I have some of them marked. For example, this is going to be red, this is going to be white, this is going to be white, this is going to be red, this is going to be white, this is going to be red. So now I need to have patterns for those individual colors. So that's what I'm trying to sort out right now. And it's a little bit tricky, but I'm doing my best. So this is what I started with this morning, just the 2 pieces for the overlay, so the 2 tiers. So this bottom one is cut on a fold and then has a couple darts, and then the larger one is basically just a longer version of it. But now I've created all of these, so my pattern has gone from being 2 pieces to being 10 pieces, and some of them need to be cut out multiple times to have lining, so it's probably going to be close to like 15 pieces once I have everything cut out, which is a lot. So basically these are the white bands on the skirt and then the red bands that will sit inside the white bands. To prevent it from being too bulky, if one of the red bands has a white border at the top and the bottom, instead of making that one piece that extends underneath the red piece, it's just going to be a band at the top and the bottom. So that adds to the quantity of pieces. And then there are also a couple pieces that are just going to be used to trim down the bottom edges of the larger pieces that I showed you a minute ago in order to get them to sit properly. I also have to cut out tulle overlays for all of the red portions to make sure that they match. And after these are assembled, there are going to be ruffles going across across the bottom edge, that will be additional pieces. So it's a lot, but I think it's going to end up being really great. And I'm really excited to get to work on it today. So I'm going to start getting these pinned onto their corresponding fabrics and hopefully get everything cut out so I can proceed. So I got the bands and the draped panels cut out, both of the red and the white. And now I am focusing on the top two banded details because that seems like the most fun part to work on. So it took a little bit of trial and error, and I'm not totally happy with it, but I'm happy enough to carry on with this method for creating the panels for the front of the skirt. So now that this one's done, or relatively close to being done, or some part of it is done, I can move on to repeating those steps on another panel, and this time I'm going to film it. So what you just saw is the first band, so it's the smallest, and this is the second band. So this edge needs to be folded inward and then sewn onto this edge. And there's a 1/2 inch allowance. As you heard, I was interrupted, but basically I was just saying that I had to fold the bottom edge of the red panel inward, and I had to mark a line across the top edge of the white panel. And then the folded edge of the red piece would align with the line on the white panel, and I could top stitch the red piece over the white piece. So here I've marked a chalk line 1 inch away from the bottom edge of the red piece on the interior. I'm just folding the bottom edge upward to meet that line to create an even 1/2 inch hem. Once that's done, I'm basting along this edge, just loosely using waxed threads and large stitches so it doesn't take particularly long. With that done, I'm marking 1 inch away from the top edge, and this is where the next layer is going to overlap this layer. So this will serve as a guide for a later step. Now it is back to what I originally mentioned. So I turned that bottom edge inward and basted it down, and now I'm just aligning it with a stitch line on the white layer that goes underneath it, and that stitch line is 1 inch away from the edge. I thought I marked this with pencil, but clearly I used stitching instead, which is also a perfectly valid way to do it. So I just aligned the edge of the white layer with the lines on my seam plate and sewed 1 inch away from the edge, and now I'm matching up the hem of the red layer with that line and pinning them together. I tried a few different methods, but ultimately liked how machine top stitching looked the best, so I'm just going to be top stitching along that fold to secure the layers together. And I don't think I filmed that part. Never mind, it turns out I underestimated myself, and I did film that entire process. With that done, I'm now pinning the ruffle I cut out along the line I marked at the top of the red panel, so 1 inch away from the edge, and it will get basted on by machine before the next layer is set atop it. Alright, so this is what it looks like now. I have the ruffle on, I have it onto the bottom white band. The reason I'm machine stitching the red portions over the white portions is because the red fabric is quite thick. So when I was doing it by hand with slip stitches, it looked sort of bulky, and I had to really thoroughly press it in order to get it to look smooth. And that was causing the tulle to warp and the panels to crumple up. So that's why I'm doing that by machine, and I don't think it's very noticeable. And there's also all the machine stitching for the ruffles, so I'm trying not to let it bother me too much. However, I am going to try and hand stitch the white portions on, though we'll see if I run into the same issue. So this portion has been pinned. It has the bottom edge turned inward on the stitch point. So now I just have to align it with the top edge of the ruffle and get it pinned on, and then I can get it sewn on. So I got that pinned on, and then from the back side I sewed it on using whip stitches so it wouldn't be super visible from the front, because I do have some top stitching, but I don't want it to all be top stitching. So after that was done, I just turned the top edge inward approximately on the stitch line. There were a few points where it looked really wonky, so I think either my cutting or my stitching was off. So at those points I just eyeballed it to make it look symmetrical on both sides. So now that is basted down, which will make it easier to sew to the lining when it comes time. And I have switched to working with one of the larger panels, specifically the smaller of the larger panels, which makes the top draped section. So for this, I just got it cut out, and then I transferred the plate placement onto both sides of the panel. So I did this by folding back the pattern and then just marking it using chalk and using basting stitches to bring it to the right side of the fabric. And speaking of basting stitches, the next step is just going to be basting down the tulle overlay, and I'm only adding the tulle overlay above this line because the rest is going to be covered by the banded details. So the tulle overlay is pinned on. It does need to be pressed a little bit, but it's so minor that I can do that after it is sewn on. So I'm just going to baste this on by hand. I think it's going to be just as fast and easy to do by hand as it would be by machine. Alright, so I got the tulle overlay on, and then I got the darts sewn, and I just pressed them, and then I laid my banded detail piece atop this, making sure that the perimeter was the same size as it should be. I just realized that you can kind of see through the red, and it makes the white look less white. So I'm going to pin these together and see what it looks like on my dress form from a distance. And if it looks bad, then I'm going to have to cut another one of these banded things from the white and baste that onto the red layer before I sew them together, so you don't see the shadow of the red underneath it. And I think for attaching these together, I was originally going to turn this edge inward by hand and then turn this edge inward by hand and whip whip stitch them together. But I think it's going to be easier to just sew around the perimeter with the wrong side of this layer facing the right side of this layer, or vice versa, the right side of this layer facing the wrong side of this layer, and then flipping it outward, revealing a finished edge around the perimeter. That edge will actually be flattened by hand and stitched down a little bit further when I attach a ruffle to it, so it shouldn't be too bulky or anything. Okay, so I ended up making that lining and basting it on, and there's still a slight color difference between the seam allowance and the single layer of fabric, but it's much, much better. So now I have to go through and rip out the basting stitches that originally marked the seam allowance. As you can see, I just sewed this on and then I turned it right side out, and then I actually stitched underneath this ruffle to secure the layers together. So now I can remove these pins because I can't shift because of the line of stitching there, which is neatly hidden by the ruffle. And speaking of ruffles, the next step is going to be sewing a 2-inch, or not 2-inch, but 2 ruffle wide strip onto the bottom edge, and I'm probably gonna have to gather the top edge of it slightly in order to get it to go smoothly and sit smoothly around the curves. I've already cut out the 2 ruffle wide strip for the bottom of this layer, as well as the 3 ruffle wide strip for the bottom of the next layer, and I'm so mad that I didn't realize how much easier it is to cut apart the ruffles from the back side of the fabric earlier, because that would have saved me a bunch of time. Previously, I was pushing the ruffles out of the way and then cutting, and now I've realized that you can just flip it over and put the blades of these scissors between the ruffle and the mesh and cut that way, and it is probably 2 or 3 times as fast. So it's annoying that I didn't figure that out earlier, but better late than never. So I am the worst and honestly cannot remember when I last filmed. So basically I moved on to working on the larger of the 2 panels. I got the pleat placement marked. I also got the tulle overlay on. I turned the bottom edge inward by 1/2 inch and stitched it over top of the white. And then I seamed it onto a lining and turned it inward and then pressed that bottom edge. And then I just attached a 3 strip wide ruffle onto the bottom edge and I gathered it slightly from the underside and then sew down with whip stitches. And now I am playing around with trims because I was not particularly happy with how it looked on the dress form. I just feel like the white looks very, very harsh and I don't love it, but I also don't know if the contrast is interesting and I'm just too close to it to realize that. But I feel like it looks very harsh in comparison to the ruffles, and the ruffles are just so frilly and light and then the white layers are not. But again, that might make it interesting. It's just not quite what I envisioned. So I'm playing around with the idea of adding some heart trim, and I consulted some friends and they really liked the contrast of the white, but they also like the trim. So I think I'm going to make a larger sample of the trim so I can put it on multiple tiers and see what I think of it. And this is just a heart mesh that I gathered down, and if I do end up using this, then I would put beads or something in the center to cover the line of stitching. Shockingly, I liked how the ruffles looked, and I decided to move forward with them, which meant I needed to make a lot of ruffles. I didn't want to mark the width the strips to make the ruffles needed to be directly onto the mesh because then it would be visible on the finished garment. I wasn't planning on pressing these, so I couldn't even use a pen that disappeared with heat or one that disappeared with water. So instead, I used strips of twill tape and cut strips of cotton to be the exact width I wanted the ruffles to be, and then I pinned these onto my fabric and cut across the edges of the strips. I basically created a pattern out of fabric, and the reason that I did this out of fabric instead of paper is because the paper sometimes shifts slightly out of place when you pin it on, whereas the fabric is soft enough that doesn't really do that. I actually find that the fabric we're marking directly onto the material gives you a more precise outcome than pinning a paper pattern onto it. So for something like this, where they're so narrow and I really want them to be consistent, I feel like this is the best method. I can't remember how many strips I cut out, but I do think it was several dozen. I needed a lot. And here you can see me gathering the strips after they've been sewn together to form very long strips. I made a few different sizes of ruffles and gathered at a few different points, but for all of them I'm using the numbered plate on my sewing machine as a guide for where to stitch. I'm just pushing the material under the presser foot as I sew to create gathers. And I'm gathering these down to between 1/2 and 1/3 of their original length. So if I start with a 30-inch strip, its gathered length is between 10 and 15 inches. So I got all my ruffles made, and I made 1-inch wide ruffles that are gathered in the center, so 1/2 inch away from one edge for the top 2 tiers, as well as the top edge of the 3rd tier and the 4th tier. And for the bottom edge of those 2 tiers, I made 1.5 inch wide ruffles that are gathered 3/4 of an inch away from the edge. So it's just a slight difference, but it offers a little bit more length to the bottom. Now, because these have been gathered by machine and sewn onto the skirt by machine as well, there are 2 lines of red stitching, and to cover those, I thought about buying some narrow lace trim, some narrow red ribbon, and just stitching it on, but I decided that that was not very like me, and that instead I'm going to bead across its edge, which has been very tedious, is why I don't really remember what I last filmed, because I've been doing this for like 3 days. I tried watching Gilmore Girls while I was doing it, but I honestly feel like that show is terrible and I was very disappointed. So now I'm watching RuPaul's Drag Race, which is a lot more fun. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this beading for all of the bows at the back, because that would be a lot of work, but I will definitely incorporate some of it into the bodice when I get around to making that too. So I did drape a pattern for the back portion of this skirt, and it was sort of difficult to do because I wanted there to be lots of bows, but I wanted it to be symmetrical, but I didn't want them to overlap, but I also didn't want to look like I just copy pasted one bow at the waist and then one lower down. So it was sort of finicky, but I think I'm happy with it. However, it has been sitting in a box for a week, is now very crumpled. So I have to get this pressed and then transferred onto paper to create a pattern. So everything is now transferred onto paper. So I guess I can get this cut out. These are going to be cut out from the red, and then I'm going to cut out the tulle overlay for them because they have to match the rest of it. They are going to be bound with the white fabric. So I'm also going to measure around the perimeter of these pieces and figure out approximately how much binding I will need to make to finish off the edges. I figured out that I needed approximately 660 inches of binding. So I got all of the strips for that cut out. I marked the right side, and now I'm going to sew all the strips together with the right sides facing each other. I also just laid out my fabric to start cutting out the pieces for the back of the skirt, and then I realized that I probably had offcuts from cutting out the main piece of the skirt, and boy do I ever. So I'm going to try and use some of these first. So it has been weeks since I've touched this project, so I don't remember what I last filmed, but I did end up getting a whole bunch of bias cut strips cut out, enough to go around all of the bows, and then I got those strips sewn together and I got the seams pressed. Actually, maybe I didn't press the seams. Maybe I just sewed them together and then threw them in a pile. But I did trim the seam allowance down. So now I'm going to press all of those seams and also press one of the long edges inward by about a 1/2 inch. And then the other unfolded edge can be stitched onto the perimeter of all of the bow pieces. But first, the bow piece is the overlay, which I've roughly cut out. So like with the other elements of the skirt, the base fabric I'm using doesn't quite match the ruffled material. So I've been covering all the pieces in 2 layers of red tulle. And unfortunately, I was not very good about storing my tulle, so it looked like this, and I had to press the majority of it before cutting out the overlay for all of the bow pieces, which were also cut out. And unfortunately, most of them were too large to cut out from scraps, which was my original plan, but I had lots of fabric, so it wasn't an issue. I did try and cut out as much of the overlay as I could from scraps of tulle, though, because the grain line of the tulle doesn't matter that much. Now all of the pieces have approximate tulle pieces cut out, but they haven't been basted together or trimmed down to the exact size, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and try and do today. Okay, so I have been busy at the sewing machine and I got all of the tulle overlays basted to the silk. This silk is backed with a black material, which makes it much thicker, which is sort of convenient for this project. It's also not very pretty. So for a lot of elements of this, where the backside of the fabric is pressed up against the body, it isn't really an issue, you won't see it. But for these, which are the tails of the bows and the bows themselves, they're going to be pleated and they're going to have some movement to them and they could potentially flip upward, and then this black backing is going to look really, really jarring. So I've cut out lining for these pieces as well, and I've used some of the offcuts of the fabric, like the selvage of silk that extends past the backing, so it has this awkward line in it. And I'm also not adding an overlay to these pieces because they really are just the back, and you're not going to see them. It's just to prevent potentially seeing the black lining, which looks really jarring, as I said. Okay, so now all of my pieces have been flatlined and are ready to be basted together. The only pieces that aren't going to be flatlined are the portions that support the bows. These pieces look like this, and these are hopefully going to sit relatively flat against the skirt and potentially even be tacked to the underskirt. They'll also have the bows mounted near the top as well as the bottom, and the weight of the bows should cause it to sit relatively flat. So I'm not particularly concerned about this flipping up and revealing the backside, which is why I haven't gone ahead and flatlined these. So these can be set aside, but the rest are going to get their lining basted in, and then I will come back over here and I will get all of the edges trimmed to be level, including the tulle overlay, which is still extending beyond the edges. There's no real reason to cut the tulle overlay perfectly down to size before basting it on. It just means you have to be more careful about keeping the edges aligned. And I don't really like being careful about that. So this is not going particularly well. I bound all of the pieces where I got the binding sewn on, and somehow I ended up stretching it when I was ironing it, so the pieces ended up being too narrow. So instead of aligning them perfectly with the edge of the fabric, I ended up spacing them about a 1/4 inch away from the edge, so there'd be more room to turn it over and to have it line up with that stitch point. And that's what I was trying to do with this piece, and as you can see, it's just getting really puckered and weird. I think part of the issue is that I pressed this, which shrunk the tulle a little bit. So for this next one, I wasn't doing that, but I was still getting that weird sort of puckering because the edges are just too curved, so the binding wants to turn completely inward instead of wrapping around the edges. So what I decided to do over here is trim the seam allowance down to a 1/4 inch, so then it's not wrapping over as sharp of a curve. I've just done a little tiny test of that over here, but it does seem to be sitting quite a bit better than how it looks over here with the 1/2 inch wide binding. So I think I might trim all of the edges down by 1/4 inch and then just have the binding be 1/4 inch wide, and maybe that will look a little bit better, but I'm not feeling too confident about this. But I also don't have enough tulle to completely recut them and redo them, and I'm not sure what my game plan would be moving forward in trying to fix this. I'm feeling a little bit frustrated because this process was supposed to be really pretty straightforward and not quick, but relatively easy. So far, that has not been the case, so wish me good luck with this. Okay, so this is the side that was pinned with the 1/2 inch binding, and as you can see, it's really creased, and I think even if I press this, I would just press the wrinkles in, it wouldn't lay flat because the edges are just not sitting flat. And then this is the side with the trimmed edges and the 1/4 inch binding, and it's sitting much better. I think I could press out these ripples because they're not as pronounced. I don't know if you can see a big difference on camera, but I can definitely see a difference in person. So I think I'm going to trim all of the edges down to 1/4 inch and then fold them inward. And for this one, I haven't pressed it inward just to avoid shrinking the tulle. I think what I'm going to do is after it is sewn down, I'm going to press from the back side, and then there will be 2 layers of silk between the tulle, which should hopefully prevent it from shrinking. Alright, so I did this part off camera, but I figured out a trim combination that I like for the ruffles. It's a little bit different than the trim I'm using around the draped portions on the front, which has a ruffle sort of underneath the panel made out of that red polka dot mesh, and then it has a heart-shaped ruffle on top, which is beaded. So for these, I didn't want to do all of that beading, and I also didn't want to cover up the binding because it's much narrower than the white portions on the front. So I wanted to do sort of a version of that incorporated the 2 different mesh ruffles that wasn't on the front side where it would distort the shape and cover the binding. So this is what I've ended up with, and I really like how it looks, but I didn't make nearly enough. So I managed to do one side of the small bow and one of the tails of the small bow, but I still have the other side and the other tail to do. I also have the big tails and the big bow. So I did go ahead and trim down the seam allowance of these to 1/4 inch, and then I folded the binding over the edges and got it pinned down from the front. I cut out 15 strips of heart mesh, got them all seamed together, and then cut out quite a few strips of the red ruffled mesh as well. And I cut these out from the back side, which, as I've learned, is way easier than cutting from the front side like I was doing for so long. Once those were cut out, they were seamed together too to form one very long strand. And then I took my white heart ruffles over to the sewing machine and pushed it underneath the presser foot as I sewed a 1/2 inch away from the edge to gather it down to about 1/2 or 1/3 of its original length. Then it was layered on top of the red ruffle and stitched down along the same point where it was gathered, creating this trim. So now I'm just going to pin this around the edges of my various pieces, and the pins that are now holding the binding in place will be moved to secure the ruffle in place, and then when the ruffle is sewn on, the binding will be secured in place at the same time. I did have some top stitching on the front panel, so I'm not too concerned about having top stitching on this as well. I'm stitching in the ditch of the binding with matching thread, so it really isn't very noticeable at all. For these pieces, I put the ruffle relatively far under, so it's only about a 1/2 inch that's exposed. And I'm thinking for these ones, since they are larger, I might have the ruffle slightly further away from the edge to add additional bulk and grandeur to them. I think that's a word. So I'm going to get my ruffles pinned on. I did only end up gathering 1/2 of them last night, so I could gather the other 1/2 if I end up needing them, which I think I probably will. I was actually having a pretty productive day yesterday and feeling pretty motivated, and then Posey ended up getting sick. She threw up all of her breakfast around 1:30 in the afternoon, so I was really worried she had some sort of blockage or something, and she really just wasn't acting herself, so I decided to take the rest of the day off to baby her. But I think she's feeling a bit better today, so I'm back to work and hopefully going to make some progress on this. I can really not remember what I last filmed for this project, but I did put it on my dress form and it did look pretty good, and then I took it off my dress form and it now looks like this. So I'm going to pull out the petticoats, which are just hanging out underneath what I have sewn, and get those set aside and then sort of evaluate where the various skirt pieces are and start getting them finished and stitched together, because there are several different layers that will eventually all be attached to the same waistband. Alright, with the petticoats set aside, this doesn't look quite as intimidating. So here I have the 2 apron-like pieces that just have the pleats at the sides pinned, and then they're pinned together around the waist. I would like to make all of that permanent today and get the pleats actually sewn by hand. These are all of the pieces that I was working on binding, which I just roughly pinned together while putting it on my dress form, and I really liked how these looked, so I can go ahead and sew the center down for these and make the bows somewhat permanent. Over here I have the underskirt, and pretty much all this needs is some trim. There's a point where the ruffles end that doesn't look too pretty and is slightly visible underneath the aprons at the back of the skirt. So I want to cover that with a little heart ruffle and then do some beading through the centers. Okay, so I got the pleats at the side stitched down using slip stitches. I wasn't as careful for the bottom apron panel because you won't see those, but I did try to hide the stitches a little bit better on the top panel. So now I'm just going to align these center points, which I've marked using a marker, as well as the darts, and then baste them together along the waistline as well as along the back edges. And then I have to figure out how I want to finish those back edges because that is to be determined. Okay, so I basted the two layers together across the top edge, and then I just folded the back edge inward. I can't really trim this edge because there's a lot of hand stitching on it, securing the darts and layers together and the beading and whatnot. So instead I'm just going to cover it with relatively wide twill tape. And to that twill tape I have sewn on my closures, which are going to be hooks and eyes. I have this hook and eye tape, which is really handy because they're evenly spaced, so you don't have to stitch them on individually. You can just stitch on the tape. Unfortunately, this on its own would be too narrow to fully cover that raw edge, so I've just stitched it to some wider twill tape, and then that will neatly cover the edge. I've already got this side pinned with the eyes. I'm making it sound like this is really easy, and it is relatively easy, but you do have to use very small stitches when securing this edge on, and also this edge too, because there's going to be quite a bit of tension on this, so you can't just whip stitch it down the way you might do with typical seam binding, because it is a structural closure element of the garment as well. Okay, just finished making the ruffle, which is why my sewing machine is still on, so I'm probably not going to bother pinning it just because this will shift slightly as I sew it, and then the pins will end up being meaningless, but I'm just going to get it sewn on above this not so pretty line. I stitched the ruffle on by machine, which was relatively easy to do, but I had a lot of trouble handling this when I was trying to add beading to the center of the ruffle. Did I even need to add beading to this? No, it's really barely visible on the finished garment, but I wanted to do it, so I did it, but I was struggling to do it, so I did something abnormal for me. Instead of hand stitching on the beads a few beads at a time, I ended up stringing them on some heavy duty upholstery thread. I had a very long string following the bead pattern I wanted, and then I just whip stitched that onto the center of the ruffle. And since I didn't have to worry as much about the beads being butted up against each other, this is much faster and easier to do, and though the weight of the skirt was still working against me, I didn't have to deal with it for as long because the beading pattern was already sorted out and just being whip stitched on there. However, in a few minutes you'll see me use my more typical beading method on the bodice. Okay, so I got these skirt layers on the dress form along with the petticoats, and they haven't been sewn together and I haven't added a waistband yet, but I was feeling eager and decided to go ahead and drape the bodice. So this is what the bodice looks like draped out of muslin, and now I'm going to get this transferred to paper. The majority of this will be out of the red with the tulle overlay. I'm not sure what the collar is going to be made out of yet, and then this will be gathered heart mesh at the front. And then it slopes up at the back, as bodices typically did during this period, and I think I'm going to end up adding some fake flowers or something there. I do also have the second bow, and I made some progress on the bows that I'll show you as well. So I got the bow components sewn together while I was on a Zoom call, which is why I didn't film it. So I just sewed the tails to the center of the loops, and then I ended up adding a little bit of beading to the center of the bows, so just covering where the binding is stitched on. I wanted to incorporate beading into the back of the skirt somehow, but I didn't want to bead all of the edges just because that's a lot of work and a lot of beads, and I don't have a lot of beads or a lot of time left to finish this. I did, however, spend several hours stitching beads onto the underskirt, which you're probably not even going to end up seeing, but I think adds a really nice bit of sparkle and makes it look more cohesive with the aprony front panels. So my goal for today is to get the waistband on the skirt, as I want the bodice to slope nicely over top of the skirts, which really means the skirts need to be done first, or at least the silhouette of them needs to be done. The trims and the bows and whatnot aren't crucial for this next step, but getting them sewn together all on one waistband is. So that's the goal for today. All right, so the top edges are now all basted together. There's the underskirt, there's the aprons, and then there's little back panels. So I've just basted those together around the top edge, and now it's time to sew on the waistband, which I'm gonna have to do by hand because this edge is so thick. So I've created my waistband, and it's just a 2.5 inch wide strip with band roll fused 1/2 inch away from one of the edges. I'm going to stitch it on with the right sides facing each other with my stitches right up against the band roll, and then I'll press it flat. I will fold the raw edges of the skirt into the waistband, and then fold this edge inward and stitch it over top of it. So now that the waistband is on, I can do a fitting of the mock-up, which is what I've spent the morning working on. So I got the draped pieces transferred onto paper, I added seam allowance, I cut it out of muslin, and then I seamed them together. I did also mark the waistline on all of the pieces, and then I sewed twill tape across the waistline to serve as a waist stay so it won't warp at that point. I've had that happen with mock-ups a lot, and then the final garment ends up being too small because the mock-up just stretched when you were fitting it. I've been procrastinating hardcore this morning because I really don't want to take this and all of the petticoats off my dress form and put them on in addition to a corset just to do the fitting, and then I'm probably gonna have to repeat this process several times making alterations. I really don't like fitting mock-ups. I just find it very stressful and very physically uncomfortable, so I'm not eager to do this, but it does have to be done. And the sooner it's done, the sooner it's over with. So let's do it. Alright, so I don't know how well you can see. I'm going to try and film this very quickly because my dog's being noisy, but it actually fits really well. I'm very impressed. I'm just going to have to take it in a little bit at the front, but that's no big deal. However, I'm getting this rippling at the side because there's too much volume in the skirt and it's pushing the bodice up. So I'm going to take it off really quickly and try cutting little slashes below the waistline and adding little gores and seeing if that makes a difference. So this after doing that slash, that resolved pretty much all the issues. As you can see, it is now gaping open right here, so I'm going to add a 1-inch addition there and then do the same thing to the back. The waistband isn't sitting exactly where it should be, so that's why there's a little bit of wonkiness going on, but I'm confident that this will make all the difference, and I think that's pretty much the only change I have to make in addition to taking these front sections. I went through and made the necessary changes to my pattern, and then I cut my pattern out of a lightweight cotton, which is going to serve as the lining. I've gone through and transferred the waistline onto all of the pieces of the lining, and I also marked the boning channel placement. So some of these are going to have boning channels 3/4 of an inch away from the edges, so they'll sit right up against the seam allowances, whereas others are going to have them through the middle to offer support to the center of the pieces. In the case of the back panels, the bones are going to be at the back to reinforce it there. With all of these marked, I can now use the cotton piece I've cut out as a guide for cutting out the silk layer as well as the overlay. I think I'm going to do this on the 2 front panels first, since they're going to have a gathered little addition, and that would be fun to work on, and I'm sort of in the mood to work on it. So I might do that first and then come back and repeat the process for all of the other panels later on. So last night I got all of the boning channels sewn, and then I got all of the layers cut out, and I got all of the layers basted together. So these are going to be the side and back pieces, and here I have the front and side front pieces that I've just assembled. And I'm focusing on these first because they have a ruched heart mesh overlay at the front point. So I've just basted some white fabric across where that overlay is going to go, so it will appear white as opposed to having the red underneath it. After that was done, I just cut out a 3-inch wide strip of the heart fabric, and I tapered the ends, and then I gathered the top and bottom edges down roughly. And I'm going to align the bottom edge of the mesh and get it basted on as well. I've been filming so sporadically that I can't remember what I filmed, so that's going to make this video interesting to edit and probably interesting to watch too, or perhaps repetitive depending. So I ended up sewing binding onto the top edge of the bodice panels, and then I just stitched a little ruffle atop it, and after the collar is sewn on, I will go ahead and add some beading there as well. Now I have to repeat that process of binding on the back panels, which I also got sewn together. And after these were sewn together, I added the boning, and I trimmed the seam allowance using pinking shears and whip stitched the seam allowance down, as you can see. And the whip stitches only go through the lining layer, so they're not visible on the exterior of the garment. The only seam I haven't done this on is the side seam, which I haven't stitched up yet either, and I'm waiting to do that last because that's going to be where I make the majority of my alterations, that as well as the center back. So I don't want to clip this seam allowance until I'm confident that the bodice fits, and I haven't quite reached that stage yet, though I will be soon. But before doing that, I will just bind this top edge. This edge doesn't need to be bound yet because it is going to be part of the sleeve, and I do also have to trim some of these edges to make them level because I made some alterations after my final mock-up that got in the way of these. But last night I spent the majority of my time on the sleeves. I did take a few photos of the process, but I basically started just by drafting a pattern that I liked the length of and the shape of and the fit over my arm. Then I added 1/2-inch seam allowance to the top edge and 1-inch seam allowance to the side edge or the underarm edge as well as the bottom edge. After this was done, I used a soft ruler draped over top of this to figure out how puffy I wanted the sleeves to be. And this is about 5 inches, and I decided that I wanted the puff layer to be 7 inches, so it would provide extra volume. I gathered down the bottom edge 1 inch away from the edge, and then stitched it onto the lining layer that I'd cut out of tulle, matching up the bottom edges. Then I turned the bottom edge inward by 1 inch, and stitched about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, creating a channel for boning to go through. Then I stitched 1 inch away from the top edge to create a guideline for where the ruffled trim would go. One of the red ruffles was sewn on along that line, then the other one was sewn on along the top edge. Oh, and I did also at some point stitch a ruffle just right above the boning, and I'm actually going to be beading at the center of that ruffle. In fact, for this sleeve, I've already done that, and then after this was all done, I did opt to add another ruffle to the bottom edge, which is just cross-stitched or herringbone stitch to the interior of the boning channel. Actually, attaching these is a way off, but I do want to go ahead and get them finished, so I'm going to get that ruffle stitched onto the bottom edge of the remaining sleeve as well as all of that beading. These are the two collar pieces, and I'm not going to be sewing these sleeves directly onto the collar. I'm going to be tacking the collar over top of them after they're sewn on. Instead, I'm going to sew these sleeves onto twill tape that is stitched from the corners of the bodice pieces. And to figure out the right length for the twill tape, I'm just going to be cutting between the point where the collar attaches to the bodice to the shoulder seam. And I'm going to repeat this for the front piece, which is here, and the back piece. And then I'm just going to pin these onto the corresponding bodice panels. When I do the fitting, this will imitate how the collar will end up fitting, and it will also create a structure that the sleeves can be stitched onto that isn't overly bulky. This is the collar, and I've backed this with a layer of medium weight canvas interlining just to give it more rigidity, since this is the most structured element of the bodice. I just backed the front pieces of the collar with the canvas and then seamed them together. And now I'm going to seam the lining in, much like I did with the bows, and then I'm going to bind the raw edges. Last night, I think I left off by showing you how the pieces for the collar were coming together. I had the pieces flatlined with a medium weight canvas, and then I also had them seamed together at the shoulders. So I just went ahead and seamed the lining and the front fabric together, and then I stitched bias binding around all of the edges, and I folded it over the edge and top stitched it down. And I stitched in the ditch much like I did with all of the bows, so the stitching wouldn't be super visible. And I was extra unconcerned about it because I knew I was going to add beading. So that's what I've done. I alternated crystals and seed beads around the neckline, which took forever because these are tiny little beads and I wanted it to look continuous. And then around the bottom edge, I added a 1-inch wide ruffle that was gathered down the center. As promised, here I'm using my more common method of beading around the collar. So I'm just sewing on 1 pearl and 1 seed bead at a time. Bring the needle up through the fabric, stringing the beads, bring it back down where the beads end, and then bring the needle back up right where the bead ended, stringing another 2 and repeating the process over and over again until it goes around the entirety of the collar. And yes, this took a very long time, but I am committed to my art, and by art, I mean sparkle. And I really, really like how this looks. And it's going to get even more ruffly. I'm going to have a red ruffle hanging from the bottom edge, and then I think I'm going to do a little ruffle coming out from underneath the neckline too. I ended up getting all of the ruffles stitched onto the collar. So I went with 1 heart-shaped ruffle that's about 1 inch long, and then 1 of the red ruffles underneath it. And then I actually shortened 1 of the red ruffles, and then I whip stitched that edge to the underside of the collar. So you can sort of see what it looks like in there. So I really like how this looks. I'm excited to get it stitched onto the bodice pieces. I'm not looking forward to doing the actual fitting, but I'm hopeful that this will fit, and then I can start to get all of the elements put together and see what the finished thing is going to look like, and that does excite me. Okay, so I now have the sleeves sewn on. I sewed them on with a 1/2 inch allowance to the underarm, and then I ended up tacking the top edge to some twill tape, and then I tacked the collar to the twill tape. So it does not look too great in there. I am already considering making an 1880s costume and focusing more on the construction, trying to piece together something that looks as good inside as it does outside. But for this, it hasn't had a clear plan. I've been on a deadline. I'm just sort of trying to get it done, and that involves being creative in ways that don't necessarily look great on the interior. So on top of all of that, I did my fitting, and I ended up taking it in a little bit at the waist. I just took it in at this seam, which is why it looks a little bit bulkier than the rest, and then I stitched the seam allowance down. So I'm going to add the final bone, or final bones rather, to those seams, and then I'm going to sew binding onto the bottom edge. I'm also going to go ahead and add the beading to the front, and then the bodice will be pretty much finished aside from closures at the back. We have a dramatic lighting change, and not necessarily a positive one, because I've moved this downstairs to get some photos of it on my dress form. I'm really happy with how it's looking, and it's pretty much finished, or at least as finished as it's going to get in this video. I still have closures to sort out for the bodice as well as the back of the skirt, and clearly I still have basting stitches to remove. But I got that little bit of beading it done on the neckline. This was all done earlier, but I beaded the little ruffled portion, and I think it looks really cute. I used a combination of beads that are used elsewhere on the project to really tie it in. And then I also got bias binding stitched onto the bottom edge of the bodice using the same method you saw for the bow components earlier on. Lastly, I folded it inward at the center back along the line where the the bone is. I just added a couple stitches along the side of the bone to get a really sharp crease at the back, and then I folded the back edge inward by 1/4 inch and just slip stitched it to the lining. So now that edge is finished, and I will ultimately end up adding hooks and bars there, or sew eyelets or do some sort of closure, but that's not going to happen in this video because this project took a lot longer than I was expecting. And that is all I have filmed. I'm sorry if this footage ends a bit abruptly, but that's all I've managed to accomplish on this project thus far. I'd really hoped to have it finished in this video, but it was just so complicated and so different from anything that I've done before that it just didn't quite come together in time. So I still have to tack some pieces of the skirt together, I have to add closures to the back, I have to add a little addition to the back, and then I have to sew on all of the bows that I created. For the sake of this video, I have pinned everything as it will hopefully finally end up looking, and photographed it on my dress form for your viewing pleasure. The bodice also needs closures, and I have to go through and remove a whole bunch of basting stitches, and perhaps add some bows to the sleeves or to the front to jazz it up a little bit. But again, I didn't quite have time to accomplish that, and I'm still sort of brainstorming on whether that would add or distract from the details I've added to the bodice thus far. Even though I didn't get this completely finished, and even though I can't share worn photos because of that fact, I do hope you guys really enjoyed watching this project come together, and that you're really liking how it looks so far. Unfortunately, it's not going to be worn anywhere as exciting as the Met Gala, but that's okay. As per usual, for me, the fun is more in making the costume than actually wearing the costume, because you don't have to wear a corset while you're making it. If you're interested in seeing the final few steps of completing this, as well as footage of it worn, then I hope you'll subscribe and stay tuned. I think there's a project vlog in my future that's going to focus on finishing up a few historical works in progress from a few different centuries. And of course, if you did enjoy, then giving this video a like and a comment really helps me out. Thanks so much for watching, and I will talk to all of you very soon.